Hello and welcome back to another episode of A Glass with Billy. I'm here with my friend
Andy.
And we're here at the lovely Dongtan Park, which is in Suwon. And it's actually kind of noisy today. They're doing some
construction.
So I'm not sure if you can hear us well, but if you can't, maybe we'll just dub over our voices or something like that. Can you hear me fine?
Yes.
All right, then let's get grooving.
Sounds like an idea, Billy.
Andy, how long have you been studying Korean?
I kind of don't want to say actually, because I don't speak as well as I should do for the amount of time that I've studied. But I've been studying for over a decade. Let's put it that way.
He's being humble. He speaks Korean at least as good as me, if not better. Now, this video isn't just going to be a tips video, though. I've already made plenty of videos about tips for learning Korean. We're just going to be talking about when we look back at all of our Korean learning, what things were the most helpful to us? What things made the largest impact? First of all, if you're not already subscribed here, make sure to like the video and subscribe, and let me know what was the most effective thing for you in learning Korean as well. First of all, to get it out on the table, being married to a Korean, was this the most effective thing? Was this the most helpful thing for learning Korean?
Well, in my case, not at all. I studied Korean at university actually before I got married, and then I came to Korea after that. So yeah, I was able to speak Korean before I got married. So yeah, in my case, getting married didn't have a big impact on my ability to speak Korean. Obviously, I'm able to speak Korean every day with my wife, which is great. But in terms of learning it, especially early on, had no impact pretty much.
Yeah, I would be the same way. And the reason I mentioned it is because you probably hear that people say that all the time, like, oh, you speak Korean because you married a Korean, that's why you speak Korean. I spoke Korean before I met my wife even. I mean, I don't know about you, but my wife's not a Korean teacher.
Right, yes. I mean, that's normal for native speakers, you know, unless you learn how to teach your mother tongue, then it can be very confusing trying to answer, you know, those types of questions from learners, especially if you're asking about grammar or something like that.
Right.
So it's understandable.
So I think the only way that marrying a Korean would be the most effective thing, would be the most helpful thing, would be as if you married a Korean teacher. Maybe you have the same experience, but I'm already very used to hearing my wife speaking in Korean.
Right.
So if she says something to me, it's not ever going to challenge me.
Right. Yeah. When you spend a lot of time with someone and you live together with someone, you can almost communicate without saying like full sentences as well.
Yeah.
You know what you're saying to each other. Sometimes my pronunciation even gets lazy at home because I know my wife will understand things, and it's not something I'm doing purposely.
Just getting that out first, that was not the most effective thing for learning Korean, is marrying a Korean. What was, though, I think, having Korean friends, I think was the most helpful thing for me for learning Korean out of everything that I could think about.
Definitely agree. Yeah, for me that was a huge part of learning. I mean, one of the reasons I started learning Korean was because I had Korean friends.
Okay,
so
same.
It was really fun to, learn new phrases and things and start to use those phrases that I'd learned with my friends. It was like, oh wow, I can communicate with them in their own language. Friends also motivated me because, I wanted to be able to communicate with them more, get closer to them. And when they were talking with each other in Korean, I kind of wanted to know more what they were talking about.
That's a good point you brought up. There is a really big difference between what we call textbook Korean, and then there is real Korean, which is the type of Korean people will use on a regular day-to-day basis. And then there is a different kind, slightly higher level Korean, which is Korean that Koreans might use to other Koreans who they know are native speakers, and when they're not on camera. You can learn textbook Korean without going to Korea. Yep. You can learn regular Korean just by talking with Korean friends, but you cannot learn that third type without having direct interactions with, I guess, groups, groups of Korean people.
Yeah, for me that was a huge thing. During university I moved out of home and I started living with Korean friends. I lived with these older guys from Gyeongsang-do province, which was interesting because they use dialect as well. Right. But anyway, it was great because I was able to hear how Koreans talked with each other.
Like really how they talk.
Yeah.
That's something that I noticed, is that when I was a beginner, Koreans would speak to me and I would actually, I'd understand a good portion of what they were saying, but then they would turn to talk to their friend. I didn't get anything that they said with their friend, and I didn't realize at the time, but that was kind of Korean to Korean off camera, candid interaction.
Yeah.
So you got a lot of opportunities then to do that by living with other Korean people.
Yeah, it was definitely very helpful. And like obviously I was studying Korean at uni as well, but to be honest, it wasn't the biggest help. I mean, obviously we're reviewing vocabulary and doing tests and things like that. But in terms of like speaking everyday language, living with Koreans together and listening to them speak to one another, and then trying to also take part in those conversations, which it's definitely challenging to enter into a conversation that native speakers are having. I mean, it was super helpful. I'm not going to pretend that it was easy, but it challenged me enough that it really helped me to improve my speaking skills, confidence, and then obviously also my listening as well.
Okay, so then I think we've established Korean friends as definitely one of the most helpful things looking back for learning Korean. Also, I wanted to add that for me, I wasn't really a fan of K-pop or dramas or movies or anything like that. So talking with other people was the only way that I could get exposure to how Koreans speak. So if I didn't have friends just living in Korea, I would not have learned Korean very much at all. Also, for having friends is, when I was a beginner, I didn't really know any K-pop. I didn't know any Korean movies or TV shows.
Yeah.
So for me, having friends was like necessary. Otherwise, I wouldn't have really had any sort of listening practice for Korean in the first place.
I think that's not uncommon, like in my case, I was interested in like movies and music, so it helped me a lot. Basically just for kind of casual exposure to the language. Obviously learning with lyrics isn't the best thing.
Right.
And I think you've done a video about that as well,
don't use K-pop for learning Korean, something like that.
But just as casual exposure and, to listen for fun, it was fine. But watching movies, I would watch the first time with English subtitles because I was still an early learner,
Right.
And then after that, I'd watch it with Korean subtitles.
Oh, so you'd watch it more than once?
Yeah,
okay.
I'd watch it several times. And when I watched it the second time with Korean subtitles, obviously I'm still a beginner learner, I'm not going to understand anything, but I'd try and pick up the things that I had studied. It would be like, reviewing and also the enjoyment of understanding some of the movie myself. And then the third time, I watched it again with no subtitles.
That's the most appropriate way to use Korean media for studying, is you watch it multiple times.
Just be aware that when you're watching movies, some of the vocabulary might be quite hard, especially depending on the subject matter of the movie.
Right.
If you're watching like some political thriller, and that goes for dramas too. If you're watching some political thriller, then there's going to be a lot of hard language, like language that even I don't really know now.
Yeah, or like medical drama, and you're going to learn the word for like, forceps or something like that.
Right, exactly. Yeah. But if you look out for like the everyday expressions and expressions that you have learned already, it can be quite rewarding, I think, and that helped me a lot.
So then that leads us to the next thing, is how helpful was living in Korea to your Korean learning?
Well, for me, I mean, it was definitely helpful. But again, I could speak Korean before I came to Korea. When I lived in New Zealand, I guess I lived in a big city, and so there were a lot of Koreans. I wasn't specifically like, looking for some person to use as my language partner or thing like that. But I was basically, trying to get more exposure to Korean, and, while doing that, I just ended up making friends.
For me though, I think being in Korea was more helpful than maybe it was for you, because I didn't speak much Korean at all before I was in Korea. Especially, 16 years ago when I first started, I was much more of a shy person than I am today. And I wasn't able to really go out and, into Koreatown. I lived in LA. I couldn't really go to Koreatown and just talk to people randomly. I was a bit too shy for that. So being in Korea though gave me an opportunity to use Korean on a regular basis. And to anyone who's thinking about possibly, going to Korea, studying in Korea, go for it. I think it would be a great experience. Not to say that if you go to Korea, you will get fluent. There's a better chance that you'll have opportunities to use it on a regular basis than if you're somewhere else.
Also, while I was in New Zealand, I chatted online a lot with Koreans who were living in Korea. And so then when I came to Korea later, I would end up meeting them and becoming closer friends with them.
If that was a long 10 years ago or so, you said?
Yes, we were chatting on MSN chat rooms, which, not MSN Messenger, I mean MSN chat rooms.
Yeah, yeah.
Now everyone's like, man, these guys are old. And also as an early learner, you know, being able to take my time and think what I was about to type, that really helped as well. You know, I was able to construct a sentence in my head and then type that out, and then, you know, they would reply back to me, and then I would, you know, try and understand that sentence.
Right.
Yeah.
And you have time to, like, you know, maybe use a dictionary or kind of think about exactly what you want to say.
It helped me a lot with just being able to, you know, work things out myself as well. Yeah.
So then chatting with people would be another thing that you would say was one of the most helpful things for you. It kind of all comes back to having Korean friends that you can practice with. Then the next thing, actually, I think that was one of the most helpful things for me looking back, calling my friends. These days you can call people on Kakao Messenger or anywhere on the internet. There's tons of free programs. Oh, one time when I was studying Japanese before Korean, I made a phone call to a pen pal I had. This was when I was like 16. And I talked for maybe 30 minutes and my mom got a $300 phone bill. We don't have to deal with that anymore though. And in fact, this is probably the main way that I got my Korean speaking practice when I'm not in Korea. And whether I'm calling my friend from the US or calling my friend while I'm in Korea, it's the same effect.
And voice calls are definitely more challenging as well. And I know people these days hate phone calls. I hate phone calls.
Oh, I hate phone calls actually too.
Yeah, I really don't like phone calls. But in terms of learning to speak a language, it can be like a huge help. It's challenging because it makes you nervous.
But I found that for me, something that helps with that is having a regular schedule. So instead of saying like, oh, maybe I should call my friend today, I actually set up twice a week where I talk with my friends on a schedule that I put in my calendar. And if I'm tired, it doesn't matter. I wake up and do it. I feel obligated to do it. And most of the time I enjoy it. I want to do it. And those few days when I really don't want to do it, well, I still do it anyway.
Yeah. How long do you usually do voice calls for?
I'll do it maybe twice a week, sometimes 3 times a week for about an hour or so, maybe an hour and a half each time.
I think if you're an early learner, you don't have to, you know, try and talk for an hour.
That's not going to be very feasible. If you're already able to speak Korean, you can talk for, you know, several hours. But if you're a beginner, just something like, you know, 10, 15 minutes.
Yeah. It can also help with pronunciation practice. You'll find that sometimes after you speak Korean for a long time, your mouth gets tired. But, you know, the more you do it, then the more your, you know, mouth will get used to using those like muscles you might not use in your own mother tongue.
So I'm pretty sure that's all of what was the most helpful to me when I look back on my entire Korean learning journey. Unless you have anything else that was more helpful?
Drinking.
Drinking?
Yeah. If you are of legal age, having a beer or a soju helped relax me, you know, together with friends. You know, I told you before I was around, you know, groups of Korean people speaking Korean with each other. You know, it helped me to get the confidence to, you know, take part in that conversation and, you know, give my input and say something.
So if you're someone who's really shy and you don't really want to use Korean, then it could be helpful for that. I also find that sometimes for me, if I go singing beforehand, like if I do some activity with them, then I feel a little bit more loose.
Right, yeah.
Than if I just have to start speaking. So yeah, you could do drinking, spend some time with them,
or just
relax.
even some board games.
Yeah, just something to kind of break the ice so it doesn't feel like you're doing a Korean test. Anything that helps so that you can have more speaking practice with multiple people.
Yeah, I'm not saying go get drunk or absolutely plastered. That's not going to help your Korean.
No, definitely not help your Korean. Okay, so that was the most helpful things for us when we were learning Korean. For those of you who have already learned Korean somewhat, what was the most helpful thing for you to get to where you are? Let me know in the comments. I'm interested to hear your experiences. Like this giant car horn. Okay, again, thanks for watching. This is Billy.
Andy.
And we'll see you again next time. 그럼 다음에 또 봐.